Many people say that music is a universal language. If that's the case, I would like to use music as a platform to talk about health. My name is Dr. Moshe Lewis, and I'm a full-time practicing physician who loves music and the way it affects our brains, our bodies, and our well-being. I would like to invite you to tune in where we interview musical artists about health matters that are important to them. But the truth is, we'll be discussing topics that affect all of us. From mental health to body image, cancer screening to stroke, our health is truly our greatest asset. So the goal is to open the dialogue on health to embrace topics that we don't always like to talk about in a way that's raw, candid, and lit. Hopefully, these discussions will improve the health of our community. After all, your health matters to me, and if I can make it sound more beautiful, then that's something we should all listen to.
Music and medicine, when you hear those words, how do they speak to your heart?
Music and medicine, music is medicine. You feel me?
Welcome. This is Dr. Moshe Lewis from Music and Medicine. We're delighted to be in New York in the home of Judy Collins. What a delightful American songstress she is. So kind and so wonderful. Her music just resonates throughout our hearts and throughout our lives for over 6 decades. She's had 2 Grammy Awards, multiple platinum and gold albums, multiple books that she's written. But more importantly, her song really has, and her music has so resonated with us to give a spirit of healing and warmth through times of hurt, through times of joy. And we're so delighted to be here because also she's got a wonderful book of poetry out now, and we're going to get into that. Sometimes It's Heaven. Thank you so much for welcoming us into your home, Ms.
Thank you.
Collins.
It's my pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Absolutely. I wanted to roll back the clock of time a little bit and really talk about your childhood because I think it can be so telling. You grew up in a home where your father was blind and yet a broadcast on the radio. Your mother, a pianist, and also taught you how to play the piano and to sing. Talk to us about what it was like growing up in those early years with them.
Well, before it was sort of like a circus, when there were 7 of us, there were only 3 of us. I was the only child for a little while,
Right.
4 years or so. And so I was born in Seattle, and my father had already started his radio career in Seattle in 1937. And he met my mother on a bus, and she made the mistake of suggesting she could help him out because she saw him reading a Braille book, on the bus.
Sure. Wow.
And so he was rude to her. And then he made up for it. And he said, "Oh, she must be beautiful." And so they got off at the same stop. And he was going up the street to play at Sammy's or something, Joey's or something club. And she lived right down the street. And so she said, "Well, we'll go there. We go there all the time."
Sure.
So they started going. And one day he said to her, "I hope you'll listen to my radio show because it's on Saturday night." So she went with her friend Eileen. She turned on the radio, and pretty soon she was sobbing. And Eileen said, "Marjorie, what's the matter with you?" And she said, "That's the man I'm going to marry."
Wow. You had that.
And then she had to go and explain to her parents that she was going to marry a blind man who was going to make his living playing the piano.
Yeah.
They were not so happy about that.
Exactly.
Anyway, he had a great radio career, 30 years on the radio, and he sang all the songs of Rodgers and Hart, Rodgers and Hammerstein. He also sang Danny Boy,
Yeah.
and he and his best friend, Holden Bowler, sang all the Irish, Scottish, and English ballads as well. So I got influenced by those, and then I was playing the piano by the time I was 5.
Yes.
So I was playing Mozart and Chopin and Rachmaninoff and so on. But I was also totally engaged with what my father did. I thought it was magic.
Sure.
He went on the radio. He read Emerson. He read Dylan Thomas. He talked about politics.
Wow.
He did all of these things. And I thought, oh my God, that's such an exciting life.
Sure. Well, interestingly enough, if I'm not mistaken, opera really was one of your first loves of music. Talk to us about how it spoke to you because it's so passionate and it's so intense.
Well, my teacher, Dr. Brico, when I started studying with her, she, of course, had her own orchestras in Denver. She was a big opera buff, although she did everything, classical opera, and I sang Pagliacci. I sang in the chorus of Pagliacci. And I sang in all of her works that she had. And she had lots of people come through Denver who knew her from New York because she was the first woman to conduct the New York Philharmonic
Wow.
and the Berlin Philharmonic. And I actually made a movie about her, which is called Antonia, A Portrait of the Woman.
Yeah.
And I was nominated for an Academy Award in 1975.
Okay.
And I just found out
Yes.
that I was nominated for an Academy Award for,
Yes.
and I don't have a membership that gets me the screenings of the movies. So I have to look into that.
Sure. Absolutely. Wow. I wanted to also, but the show is called Music and Medicine, talk about over time how you've come to deal with the fact that your mother had mental health issues. And as a young child, to be separated at that age, as I was from my father, it can be so challenging. Is there some wisdom or some pearls that you've developed over time that you would share with others who may have a family member, but as a child, be dealing with the fact that they are having to see or witness that?
Well, my father was blind. There were lots of things that compensated for that. He never used a dog or a cane. My mother was, she was about as close to being a Christian Scientist as she could get. She became another kind of religion as she got older. But my family, we went to church, we were Methodists, but my father drank, so there are illnesses and there are illnesses. There are mental illnesses which come with drinking and so forth. So when I was a kid at 14, he had asked me to do a piece by a very, very complicated composer. And La Campanella, it was called. It was a murderous piece of music, and he wanted me to play it in public.
Right.
He was doing a big show for the auto show in Denver. He wanted me to play this. Well, I was driven crazy by it, and I decided I would have to kill myself.
Wow.
And I took all the pills I could find and pretty soon though, I started throwing up, and I said, wait a minute, I'm very happy to die. I'm not happy to be sick at my stomach. I won't ever go that far.
Absolutely.
And so I called my best friend, her mother, because she was married to a doctor. Her father was a doctor. And I called Marcia's mother and I told her what was going on. She said, okay, you stay. First of all, put your finger down your throat and throw up. And secondly, his name was Shepherd. Will be over momentarily. And he did come over. My mother was very upset with me.
To say the least.
She was upset with me. And my father wrote me a beautiful letter in which he said, you can't do this because you have gifts and you're going to have to, the world is going to need them. That's what he said in the letter. So it was very touching. But of course, I spent years in therapy trying to get over this fact that I tried to kill myself. I had a lot of issues. I was depressed. Of course, if I was drinking like my father, I was going to have problems.
Right.
If you're drinking, you're going to have problems. And so I was very lucky because I started singing professionally. I started getting paid for what I do. Not enough, of course. Sure. But that's always a problem we'll talk about later. And I really had a lot in my favor because I could travel. Yeah. And I loved to travel. And pretty soon I was traveling all over the world. And I was hit with things like polio when I was 11. I was hit with tuberculosis when I was 22, which kept me in hospitals for about 6 months. And that's when I came to New York. And of course, these issues of illness, I always had a feeling about illness. Even when I got polio, I knew that I was going to be fine. I knew that I would come out of this. Sure. Only because my father always gave me this idea that if you are diligent enough in life, and if you look at things and are careful of things, and you're a perfectionist like he was, you're going to get through things. I always had that feeling. I didn't think that, I know that's a terrible thing to say in a way, because a lot of people have terrible illnesses and they struggle with them. I was talking with my friend Bob Caro the other night about Roosevelt.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the most courageous man. He had polio,
Right.
of course.
That's correct.
But he did everything in his power to overcome it, to be able to appear, even when he didn't want his legs shown.
Right.
But he had this machinery going on that was, it was really from the dark ages with
Right.
polio.
To keep
But
going.
he had such courage and such compassion for people.
Yeah.
And he expressed it in such a way that I think, of course, that Eleanor had a lot to do
Yes.
with his triumph.
Yes, absolutely.
And there was that ability to have that kind of a marriage and to get the best out of both people, isn't it?
Sure. And then talking about having compassion for people, to what extent do you feel your music has really been that vehicle through which you've been able to express your compassion for others?
It's been the luckiest thing in my life, because what I have, this ability to go into a crowd. Now, I've been doing this 65 years.
Right.
I've only been off the road for these instances that I told you about. Well,
Sure.
the COVID, of course, for a few months. And having polio, was put back a grade. Having tuberculosis, it gave me 6 months to really ponder what was going on in my life. And I was getting divorced, and I had been in an abusive. It was, it wasn't abusive all the time,
Sure.
but it had its moments.
Right.
And so I knew that if I could get through things, and I was a Methodist, of course, prayer, music.
Right.
Music helped me always, but I could always play. I could always sing. And when I started to go into clubs and places, theaters, I saw and I felt what my father felt. He wanted to be the best performer, the best person, the most well-educated, the most intellectual, the funniest. He liked to tell jokes as well as everything else.
I know someone else who loves to tell jokes during her sets, and
boy,
she's
do
incredible.
I think that's the center of my show.
Yes.
I mean, people may think it's all music, but it's really jokes.
Yeah.
I work
But they're
hard
so relatable.
on the jokes. My favorite right now is that if you're smoking, you have to be aware that God takes an hour of your life and gives it to Keith Richards.
Exactly. He's living forever.
And I knew right from the beginning that people who came to see me had issues.
Yes. Don't we all?
Everybody has issues. My issues, their issues. We all have something going on in our lives that's either tormenting us or making us make another decision about something, or involving us in consulting relatives, which is a real mistake.
Exactly.
Look up your brother who's a doctor and ask him why you're so sick.
Exactly.
So I had this feeling that my audiences were particularly chosen to be in an environment where they could get some psychological and musical help.
Yeah.
And it's about being positive. It's about the fact that the song lifts you.
Yeah.
Quite often in an audience, I will sit there and I will be singing and I will think, they're here. They have a chance to be alone. They're not on the phone. Nobody's bothering them.
Yes.
They can't get up and talk to everybody. Sure. And so they're able to have this silence in their minds with the music going on, which can lead to thought.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Thought is a rare adventure for most people.
I love that. That willingness, though, to share that vulnerability. I know probably most pronounced in your first album, Judith, at least there. Really, I started to hear your voice. Where do you think that germinated from? The willingness to say, I can help others by sharing my own weaknesses, limitations, vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I have to always be aware that I can tell my story. And of course, I was lucky because when I was, 46 years ago, this coming April 16th. April 20th is my sober anniversary, so I will have been sober. I'm now 46 years sober. I met my husband, who died in December.
Yes, just recently.
I met him 4 days before I got sober, and I was dying. There was nothing left in my life. I couldn't work. I had not been able to work for a whole year. By the time I got into my next series of shows, I hadn't worked for a year and a half. And counting 1977, I had actually not worked for about 2 years and a half, 2 years and a few months. So I got sober, and that was when my life started, for real, for real. You know, the early part was a rehearsal.
Right. I remember sometimes.
I mean, I knew how to do things. I had a lot of sense, which I got from my dad, because, I mean, he was although he drank, he was very controlled, and he would never go out on a date drinking. You know, he would always wait until, and he got very interested in, speaking of health, he got interested in Gaylord Hauser, the great nutritionist to the stars. Everybody went to Gaylord Hauser. And he helped particularly women look better, feel better. You know, one of the things I haven't done of his was the slant board. You take a piece of board and you put it up and you lie on it upside down. I haven't tried that lately, but I think I should.
Almost inversion table, more blood flow to the brain.
And he got all the things together about how to fight his drinking. And he had, in the morning, he had a drink that had a raw egg in it. It had yogurt. It had wheat germ. It had all the things to be healthy.
Right.
He wanted always to be healthy.
Yes.
And he worked so hard at it, you know.
Sure. What are those elements that you feel you were battling in and maybe using alcohol as a medication for, be it your mother's mental health, be it the perfectionism your father demanded, be it changing from classical training to more secular music?
My mother was normal. My mother was normal. My mother was a wonderful cook. She was a wonderful parent. She was a great driver. She had to do all the driving, of course. And there was a period where we were on the road when my father was working on the road and my mother was driving the Buick. And I was sitting in the back seat because I was still the only kid in the block and in the family. And she really was a whippersnapper. And it started in the front seat that he had his typewriter with him. And he had his Braille books, but he started writing letters on his Braille writer. And in the years to come, when he had a driver, when she was pregnant then and she had to retire and he got a driver whose name I forget somehow, maybe Jean, and Glenn, I'm sorry, it was Glenn. And so Glenn would be driving and my father would be writing letters. And I've got 100 letters back there that my mother saved. Some of them were written to me and some to my dad. But he was such a persistent force. And I think people knew it. He had many, many, many fans in the cities where he had his shows, in Seattle, then in Los Angeles when he broadcast out of Hollywood, and then in Denver. And people adored him. They adored him. They wanted to know him. They wanted to know about his life. Yes. And they wanted to come to the radio station, which quite often they could do in those days. And he'd have a whole crowd of people come and everybody be entranced with his music. So I think that magic of being able to talk to people about life and to expose them to things that they hadn't heard about. Sure. And I think that's what happens with my singing and my storytelling. I mean, they may not want to hear the jokes, Mae West jokes, but once in a while I try to say something important.
Sure. No, absolutely. Do you see the parallels in your own life, in the fact that you've chronicled a long time, you've written poetry as well, and so many people want to see you and hear what you have to say because you're the aunt, the sister, the grandmother, the mother that everybody wants?
Yes, exactly. It's the prototype that we have in our lives, if we're lucky. I didn't know my grandparents very well. They were in Seattle. I knew, in a way, I knew my great-grandfather a little bit better because he had things that stood out, like he owned a bank and his partner stole all the money.
Okay.
And so he went back to his dairy farm and paid off the money that was stolen.
Wow.
You know, he stood up for the right thing. And I learned from him, and of course from my grandmother on my father's side. My grandmother on my mother's side, I didn't see as much, but she was a wonderful, wonderful grandmother. So I had contact with the next generation, you know, which was important. But you're right. There's something about having, a lot of people say, you know, my grandmother, she's the one who taught me X, Y, and Z, and she took me here and there and took me to the opera and, you know, made sure I had a nice pair of shoes and things like that. And I do think that there is that model of the person who tells you things that you'd like to know, sings you songs that you'd like to learn. And I think there's something very dynamic about that in the history of the human race.
Sure.
It's how we learn. And we can learn from our parents, we can learn from our grandparents, but we also have these models in terms of entertainment and not even so much show business as in the folk era, you would go and hear stories.
Yes.
And histories. I mean, Woody and Pete, they taught history.
True. Yeah.
Well, I had sort of salted my life with different things. My best friends I met in grade school. Marcia and Carol and I were best buddies. And we met in grade school, and they were both dancers, really very fine dancers. In the case of Marcia, she was chosen when she was 16 to go to England and be part of the Royal Ballet. She was a very fine dancer. And so the three of us, when we were in grade school, we decided that we had to spend time together out of school because we were the oddballs out, you know. So the first thing we did was that I said, let's do the story of Little Red Riding Hood. I'll write the songs, which I did. I sat at the piano, wrote the songs. The girls danced the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Then and so, you know, that was entertainment.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of thing in a way.
Right.
And so then I'm practicing piano, I'm practicing the Rachmaninoff piano concerto, always having to practice a couple of hours a day,
Right.
which meant that, you know, I made up for it in the 60s.
Right.
It, you know, raised hell with my social life at that point, but that all got kind of cleaned up. But then I was supposed to memorize this Rachmaninoff concerto, and it's a beautiful da 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 da, beautiful concerto. So I had it up to speed, and I was just working on the interstitial areas. And one day, I must have been 15, and maybe 16, and I was practicing, but everybody was gone in the house. I don't know where they went. I don't know whether they were at a school thing but nobody was around.
Right.
And so I stood up and turned on the radio. And what was playing was the Gypsy Rover. And it was in a movie called The Black Knight, which was an Alan Ladd movie.
Right.
And it was an old folk song sung by Leonard Desmond, I think his name was. And it was a big hit on the radio. And so I ran down to the music store in Denver, and I saw all these records, Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, the Clancy Brothers, all the old labels. And so this gentleman sold me the single,
Right.
and I said, okay. And I said, what is this? And he said, it's all folk music. It's called folk music.
Right.
So I went home and I played this record, and I called my girlfriends and I said, I then sat on the record and broke it in a number of pieces. So I couldn't play it anymore. So I had to get them to play the radio and take down the words.
Right.
And then I said, that's what we're going to do next. Instead of the whatever it's called, the one that I was doing, Little Red Riding Hood. We ditched Little Red Riding Hood and we started doing the Gypsy Rover.
Right.
And we got a couple of ringers to do things, and so we played that all over town. We met once we went to an afternoon luncheon for this women's club, and Tony Curtis was there. So we all met Tony Curtis. We were so excited.
Right.
So lately we had a big phone meeting the other day between the three of us, and Carol said, Cass is her name now. She said, oh no, it was Moshe. She said, we spent half of our school year out of class singing at the
venues.
Fitzsimmons General Hospital, the Children's Hospital, Kiwanis clubs, Lions Club, the Elks Club.
Right.
We had days at all these, and we were going to take the Gypsy Rover to Las Vegas.
Right. Sure.
And then, so that's what happened to me. And I said to my father I said, I don't want to play the piano anymore. I want to have a guitar because I want to learn the songs that are in these albums.
Sure.
So he got me a guitar. He rented it,
right.
Which I always say was because he was an optimist.
Right.
And it was a short-lived situation. I got my calluses, but I stopped playing this guitar. I didn't like it. And I didn't like the teacher. He was a jazz teacher. I didn't want that. So I started going to the Denver Folklore Society, learning the songs, going up to the mountains where Lingo the Drifter had his gang gathered, And I was a convert.
Right.
Total convert.
Sure. And almost a perfect setup for meeting people like Mr. Zimmerman, at least as he was called.
Oh, yes.
Talk to us about some of those stories of the characters that you met, like Bob Dylan.
Well, he was right away. I met him first in my second gig, which was at Central City at a club called the Gilded Garter. And he was there. His name was Robert Zimmerman. He was trying to get a job on the Hootenanny. They have these Hootenannies on Monday nights. He was trying to get, and he would sit at my feet, and he would tell me this later. He said, I sat at your feet in Central City and listened and listened and listened. And we had a few drinks together. And then we'd go over to the Teller Opera House and have a few drinks at the bar, where the face on the barroom floor was the intriguing point of contact.
Right.
And then I had this job in Central City at the Gilded Garter, and the woman that I was trading places on the stage, she was a good singer, and her husband owned the strip club in Denver.
Yeah.
Hello, honey. So he kept saying to us, you have to go to my club because I have this woman, Tempest Storm is her name, and she's dancing. She's a big star. So one day we went down to Denver.
Right.
And I'll tell you, in 2019, Tempest Storm's obit was in the Times, a great big long obit, and the very bottom, she was quoted as saying, I have to say I am so proud of the fact that I never took it all off.
Right. Sure.
And I said to Lewis, you could have fooled me. And so I saw him and I met him there. I met him back. And then when I started working at the Exodus in Denver, he was there. He was trying to look for a home, for a bed for the night, and then slowly but surely in New York, I got to New York in 1961 and he was there. And he was in the audience. And a lot of people, Cisco Houston was wonderful. He died that summer, actually. But Cisco was there, Peter, Paul, and Mary were there. Peter, I had some time with Peter before he died, and we reminisced about that. I've known him 65 years.
Mm.
And he said to me, now, if things don't work out for Mary, keep your schedule. And Al Grossman told me around that same time. Then I started recording Dylan. As soon as he started writing these songs, I recorded Fare Thee Well, My Own True Love. And And I heard him singing Tambourine Man 2 years later in his manager's house in wherever it's called, up in the country where that big festival was.
Sure, Woodstock.
And so I was drinking, of course, in those days. I was dead drunk after this party, and I was sound asleep. But I woke up when I heard his voice coming up the stairs.
Wow.
Ooh. And I heard him. I sat there on this stair at the bottom of the stairs, and I listened through this blue door, and while he wrote Tambourine Man. And Bruce Langhorne, who is the man who inspired the song, was somebody that I came to know and work with and travel with. He was a wonderful man. He only died recently. But the thing that I have forgotten, I have forgotten the piece when Leonard Cohen said to me, I don't know why you're not writing your own songs. This was in '66. I went off to White Plains, where Bruce Langhorne was living, and I took him my little secret book of writings, which were very dark. And I said, I want you to look at this and tell me if there's anything in here that sounds like it could be a song. And I went out to the porch,
Sure.
and I let Bruce Langhorne sit there and look at my private. I was so embarrassed about it. And I came back in, and he said, oh, okay, put it down like that. And then he said, I'm going to ask you to go home and write 5 different songs about a love affair. So I came home to my Steinway, which is still in this apartment. I've been here 55 years, but that's the same piano that I had at 164 West 79th. And I wrote my first song, since you've asked. I had forgotten that I'd written the songs for the Little Red Riding Hood. And nobody remembers them.
Mm-hmm.
The girls don't remember them. Nobody in Denver remembers.
But so wonderfully resonant with just that spirit of giving. Talk to us about how poetry for you has also become a vehicle to share not only your thoughts, but just really a sense of catharsis as you work through life.
You know, it's a natural. I think poetry for many people is, I went to a show at the Morgan Library not many years ago, but it was 30 years ago, and it was a gathering, a showing of people's notebooks, their journals.
Right.
A lot of them had contained poetry, and these were shipbuilders and housewives and people who worked in a refinery, and they were people from all walks of life who sat down to write, this morning I did yet, and then who wrote a poem.
Right.
And I think it's a natural outgrowth of experience in life. I mean, we read poetry, certainly when we're in school, somewhat. And then when it comes time to write a journal about what did I do today, sometimes it just comes out.
Right.
And for me, I always kept a journal. First of all, when I started therapy in New York, the first thing I did was start writing down my dreams. And so every day I would take my dream to my therapist, and he would analyze it and look at it and tell me this and that. But it's a natural thing. You write down what you did, how your day went. I mean, and what your dream was. And your dream would sometimes lead to a poem of some kind. So I've done that with regard to songwriting, and I've sort of tried to squeeze the box, because poetry is not a lyric. And when you see people who try to set poetry to music, it's often a total failure because it just doesn't work. But if you can manipulate that poem into something that's rhyming, you might get a song.
Sure, right.
You certainly could get a ballad, There are lots of wonderful old, decades old, centuries old ballads. And in fact, Dylan took a song by Martin, John Martin, English writer, called Lady Franklin's Lament. Lovely, beautiful melody, which he turned into a song called Bob Dylan's Dream.
Right.
I always thought, oh, he's a criminal. Took away that wonderful melody and put his own words to it. So people do that all the time. And in the folk tradition, you can always hear this kind of thing happen. And Dylan knew, Dylan was incredibly smart. And of course, those 10 years of that writing were, as even he says in Chronicle, he says, I don't know how it started and I don't know why it stopped.
Right.
You just don't know. Anyway, my husband said to me in 2016, I told him, I'm going to do 90 and 90 and 90. He said, why don't you write 365 poems, one a day, and then you'll have a whole book. So I did.
Yeah, sure.
And that's where these poems came from.
And it's a good segue into this. So sometimes it's heaven. So we're on the eve of the launch for this, which really is just a wonderful collection of your poetry. Really so touching and so thoughtful. It seems you have this tremendous insight to be able to really dig a deeper into one's soul or one's experiences. And where do you think that resonant voice comes from?
I have no idea. Just like Dylan, I have no idea how it started, no idea when it will stop. Although I've kept, I keep at it and I have to dig back into my phone and find those pieces that, that can be fleshed out and turned into poetry or turned into a song.
Right.
It all depends. And so I got out of these poems a dozen songs on Spellbound, my first album of the songs that I've written.
All yourself.
Which I wish I could call Leonard and say, I finally got it.
I pulled it off. It only took a couple of years. On that note, though, I'm reminded that in your 1975 album, Houses, there's this great line. Sometimes I see myself a child running through the trees, and I can find myself. So talk to us about in what way your life has been able to sort of help you find yourself. Philosophically, what are those houses now that allow for your artistic creativity?
Yeah, that's the song I wrote for Stephen.
Yes.
Of course. He had never heard it when we were on tour.
Right.
This
Stephen
wonderful
Stills, we should say.
Stephen Stills, yeah. And he hadn't heard it. He said, "You got it right." He said about it. Anyway, yes, I don't know. I don't know where these things come from because I think you're born with a certain set of options and of resources that you can go to. I mean, a resource is reading. Now, I'm a reader. You know this house is full of books, and I read. My husband was the same way, so all the rooms are filled with books. And part of that is just you're absorbing what amounts to a literary history of your culture, of who's been writing what. Why was I so attracted to Camus when I was a teenager? Right. He probably led to me to try to kill myself because he wrote about suicide. Right. So that's not really to be advised to have that happen. But sometimes you collect all this material and somehow you have an ability to translate into your own language. Sure. And that's really the secret, which is if you have an avenue of being creative, you have to find your own voice. A lot of times you'll notice that a painter, including Picasso and everybody else, they copy a lot in the beginning. Right. They copy this one and that one and so on until they find a way to come out with their own exposition of what they really are doing. But it takes time and it takes practice because you have to learn how to write. Right. You have to learn how to listen. And in music, you have to learn how to play things a little bit until you can compose. So I think that's part of it. And you, in a way, in desperation, you turn to your own resources.
Right. You've used others to grow. On that note, talk to us about, was this such a beloved song, Joni Mitchell, and first hearing her music and sort of knowing right away that you had to record that?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Again, I was drunk as a skunk that night. And it was 1967. And I got a call at 3 a.m. from my friend Al Cooper. Al Cooper is a darling man. He's a generous, loving man. And he and I were friends, just friends. But he would once in a while stay in my apartment down on 79th if I was away and he needed a place to crash, as they say. And he knew my number, and he called me because he had been introduced to this woman at the club at 3 a.m. And she said, I write songs. And he said, are they any good? And she said, oh, yes, they're very good. And so he followed her home. And he said to me, well, she was good looking, so I figured I couldn't lose. And then she started singing, and I said to myself, Judy is recording this week. I think I'll let her hear this. And he put Joni on the phone, and she sang me Both Sides Now.
Sure.
1967.
Right. How did you hear those words? How did
I
it
said,
get to you?
I'll be right over. I mean, who could turn their back on that song? You couldn't ever. Nobody ever can.
And to what extent, it doesn't seem like you're maybe completely surprised with the success, but that it still continues to resonate with people. I mean, they just put it in Toy Story 4.
They put my version in the story about the Madison Avenue people.
Yes, Mad Men.
The last of their episodes,
yes.
at the very end, they put, I didn't ever watch that show.
Sure.
But I do now.
Yes.
Or I did then. Or I will.
Or you plan to.
I might.
Perhaps potentially. Understood. Just so wonderful, all these types of stories. Talk to us about that willingness. We've been talking about vulnerability and defining things with others, with being willing to share what it was like in losing your own child. There can't be any other greater grief that a parent would wish to avoid. And yet you are willing to share with us and help us walk through. Everyone has had someone think about it, attempt it, if not complete it. And yet to be able to vocalize
more
it
than ever
is so hard.
Particularly in the military, I think they have a terrible problem. Well, you know who's helped me? I started immediately writing. Immediately. I knew I had to get something out. First of all, there was nothing except one other book that I knew of in those days. There was still a taboo. People weren't writing about it, so on. And so I knew I had to start writing immediately and started working on it. And I showed my pages to my friend who wrote what is her name now? I can't remember her name. That's terrible.
John Rivers?
No. But it does start. Julia Cameron, who wrote, what is it called? She wrote The Power. She wrote the book about writing, pages. I sent her what I was writing, and she turned it over to her publisher, Joel Fatinas at Tarcher, and he said, "Oh, this is a book." And I then did 3 books for him. I did one on suicide, one on recovery, and one on, it's called Morning, Noon, and Night. It's about the working process. What do? We get up, we start writing. We have the coffee machine in our bathroom so we can punch it and not have to go to the kitchen. And we start, which I have to once again get on the bike and start working and writing, because I've got about 10 different manuscripts, which are 100 pages and each, and I've got to make way with some of them. I had like 5 or 6 of these, and I'm trying to now integrate Lewis's life story with the one more about singing. I don't know. It's work.
Sure. There don't seem to be enough hours in the day. Where do you draw your energy from, your tenacity? Still at this point in life, 85 years, and you're 85 years young, going on 27, to still perform, tour, write?
I think it's the DNA. I look at these relatives of mine. They live to 103, 104. They're active. They're interested. They're all involved in these projects that they do. They're, the other side of that family is ferociously religious, and also they keep track of their whole birth line with everybody in their family for every place where they live, and every, they all do 32andMe or whatever that thing is. It's DNA, I'm sure. I mean, my father, he died of an aneurysm, but he didn't have to. He in those days, they couldn't find an aneurysm in 1968.
Right. Sure.
They didn't know what was the matter with him. They would do that. They'd find it now.
Right.
Probably.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's this energy. He had amazing energy.
Right.
And I don't think that there's any coincidence about it. I think it comes with the line of what you get. My husband was married to a scientist who worked for the Watson Crick people who found the DNA chain,
Sure, yeah.
and then he was married to a dancer. So he was looking for interesting people too.
Right.
So I think it's look, I'm very conscientious. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I had an eating disorder for years. I don't have that anymore. I'm working on my bones and carrying weights around. I've always exercised. I never stopped exercising. And they just took my treadmill out because it's broken. I've had it for, almost 50 years, but it's gone.
And you use it.
I have a bike in there too, but I walk a lot with weights, and that's my big thing, to get the bones back. And I have to do it for mental health.
Right.
I have to exercise. I have to eat right. I have to go to AA meetings. I have to take care of myself. I have to sleep, and I have to keep my memory of my husband strong, but I also don't want to fall apart over it. I say to my audiences, you're tonight's grief group.
Right.
And think about the things that you have, because I know that all of you have something.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We're never free of it because we're on the planet. And it is clearly a difficult place to live for most of us.
Absolutely. Last question, because we're on the eve of Town Hall, a wonderful celebration tomorrow, celebrating your 85th, celebrating the launch of the book. And yet audiences sit there because you've been kind enough to invite us in the past as well as tomorrow, mesmerized and still able to absorb and feel and enjoy so much of what you have to say. How does it speak to you to really go out on the stage at this point and still people know the lyrics, they know the words,
Yeah.
they know your life, and still they yearn for more?
Well, I have this lucky strain, and people have heard about it, they've seen me, they've listened, and they still come. Well, why do they do that? I think it's because of the comedy. That's why I think they keep coming. I am a great follower. I'll turn on Johnny Carson every time I get the chance, because he's always got a comic on who's brilliant.
Yes.
And he's brilliant with them. And we need this.
Yeah.
We need
It's
laughter. We need lightheartedness. We need to look at life and say, oh, that's impossible that happened, So I step out into a milieu that I know. It's comfortable. It's always comfortable. Once in a while, you get an audience who's not up to it. But that doesn't happen very often. It hasn't happened only a handful of times, really. So I give a little, I get a little, I get a lot back. I get more than they get. They may think they've got the whole shot, but no, I get a level of contact with human nature and human beings. That's how you live from day to day.
I love it.
Otherwise, I think you would just give up and say, well, I don't know, maybe I'll go in for modeling or something.
Well, you've been such a delight and
Oh,
so
it's so
kind
much
with
fun
your
to talk
time
to
and
you.
your
You're
art.
wonderful.
And it just has been so touching for all of our
Thank
lives.
you.
And as I said at the outset, it's really been the songbook to our existence. So we appreciate you being so willing to share, so willing to laugh and to help
Thank you.
us laugh, and so willing to give us your time and your
Thank
art,
you.
because I think so
Thank
much
you.
of it speaks to us. The layers
It's
that
a
are in your music
pleasure.
are so detailed. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
A
my
pleasure.
dear.
Sure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
God bless
Thanks.
you.
Jacob.
Thank you.